Good day to you all today. My name is Raoul Notte from the Hague University of Applied Sciences, and today I will be sharing with you the results of a research that me and my colleagues from the Hague University of Applied Sciences did with our colleagues from Saxion University of Applied Sciences last year. It was a research on evidence-based cybersecurity risk communication. It's a research that was commissioned by the VAR, which is the safety region for the city of Rotterdam and municipalities around it. And it was funded by the Dutch government, specifically the Ministry of Justice and Safety. As I told you, this research is about risk communication for cybersecurity. Why? When looking at and studying cybercrime and the fight against it, it's not only an option to look at the cyber criminals and see how you can catch them, or look at the internet as an unsafe environment and see how we can control and surveillance that environment. But it's also an option to look at the increasing of the cyber resilience of end users. And the assumption in this is always, of course, that human behavior influences the chance of becoming a victim. A lot of research lately has shown that the majority of cyber incidents are caused by human failure. So by that means, it always also means that increasing the cyber resilience of end users will decrease the amount of cyber victimization. Well, how can you increase the cyber resilience of end users? That can be done by risk communication and sending information to end users. And research by Sheng and his colleagues from 2010 already showed that effective risk communication can be very well used to increase self-protective behavior in end users and thereby increase their capacity to protect themselves and the companies that they own or where they work for. Important in this is that risk communication and sharing of information is only effective when it's customized to specific target audiences. So that means if you target a specific group and your risk communication and information is really aimed and tailored to that person or that group of persons, then it can be effective. We see that risk communication that's aimed at a broad audience and has a more broader message is less effective. So the goal of this research was actually to identify specific factors that contribute to increasing the self-protective behaviors of end users. So the question basically is, how do we stimulate self-protective behavior using risk communication? Well, in prior research that me and my colleagues from the Hague University did, we saw that SMEs, or small and medium enterprises in the Netherlands, are confronted with a high victimization rate. So in order to really target a specific audience that need the help, for this research, we decided to target the small and medium enterprises. Well, that led us to the following research question, which is quite obvious. Like, which factors contribute to self-protective behavior of business owners? And with business owners, we mean small and medium enterprises, as stated below. With regard to cybercrime threats, and how can this behavior be stimulated by effective risk communication? Well, as I told you before, we're aiming at business owners and then the business owners of small and medium enterprises. The knockoff of that in Dutch statistics is that it has to be companies that employ less than 250 people. With regards to cybercrime and self-protective behavior, we mostly aimed at the cybercrime forms of phishing and ransomware, because in the statistics we saw that phishing has made a lot of victims in the last years, and we don't see a big difference in that. And also ransomware was increasingly making victims in the Dutch society. And also worldwide, of course. So those were the factors that we applied to this research. In order to explore what these factors were, we did some literature study into risk communication, self-protective behavior, and to see if we can come to a model that might explain which factors do change self-protective behavior and which factors not. So this is the conceptual model that we use to start the research. So basically what we did, we said that from the cyber threats that are around there, that influences the awareness of a person that this threat is personally relevant, but it also influences the social attention to these kinds of cyber threats. These in their turn learn or contribute to the knowledge of the risks of these cyber threats for the person, and which not only lead to like a cognitive response, which is the knowledge of the risks, but also gives give an affective response to it, so a more emotional response. This forms a risk perception in the mind of the respondents, and risk perception in this way is the chance that it will happen to you, and perception of what the impact of the consequences will be for you or your business in this example. Then also some personal factors are influencing this, especially the risk perception, is of course prior victimization that obviously influences the perception that you have of the risk, but also your sensitivity to risk and also how much you could take risks, how sensible you are to it. Well, these effective response and this risk perception, they influence your intention of behavior, which in theory is a very strong indication of actually self-protective behavior. This intention of behavior is influenced by several things which are very important. Subjective norm is the first, and that's actually the social influence on people. So on one hand, it's what does your social environment think about applying cybersecurity to your business? Is it something that people see as common? People speak about to you, and there's also the subjective norm about if you see it as your social responsibility to protect your company and also the employees in your company from cyber risks. On the other hand, you have behavioral beliefs, and that's set out in two different aspects. First of all, is the perception of the effectivity of the actual measures that you can undertake. So the perception of, are cybersecurity measures effective in countering cybercrime? So do they work at all? Second is the perception of your own effectivity in taking these measures. So first is, are these measures effective at all? And are these measures effective when I use them? Am I capable of it? Well, of course, this is influenced by the knowledge that you have about protection and protective measures. Well, this self-protective behavior translates, of course, to a possible increase in knowledge of awareness, because people will start to read more into it and what their options are, which has some emotional consequences, and also target hardening is basically specifically the actual measures that will be taken. So those are like active decisions or actions taken by the respondent. So this was the conceptual model that we used to see actually what self-protective behavior, what factors influence that. So how did we do this? We had qualitative data from 25 interviews with business owners. Males were overrepresented. 80% was male. Average age 42 years old. I'm sorry. Most of them had a higher education, so a bachelor or a master's degree. Also, we did a quantitative survey where we sent a survey to an online panel, and we got reaction of 631 business owners. Most of them also male. 57 years old on average, and also most of them had finished some sort of higher education, so had a bachelor or master's degree. In caution, everything that is stated in the results from now is self-reported behavior. So it's what the business owners report about themselves. So if they say that they're effective in their cybersecurity measures, that's what they think, and it's not an objective measure of the effectiveness of what they are doing, of course. Well, first of all, the perception of the risk and the damage of cybercrime. As we saw in the model, prior victimization can be a strong influence on that. In the questionnaire, we saw that 8% of the business owners fell victim to cybercrime in the past 12 months. And this was mainly hacks of accounts and websites where credentials were stolen. What we saw was that in the interviews that we conducted, there was a higher prevalence of victimization. It was there 16 out of 25 interviewees. There might be a selection bias in there, in that the respondents that we got that were willing to get an interview maybe did so because they had some trouble in the last year. Well, if then we know about if we look further into the perception and the knowledge and the risk awareness, we see that from the questionnaire, the majority of the respondents indicate that they know about cyber risks, and they state that they are confident that they are aware of what risks there are in the world. And also they state that they know how to recognize cybercrime attempts, and specifically, in addition, what we also saw in the interviews was that respondents were very confident, especially in recognizing phishing emails. They state that they know them, they see them, they get them every day, but they know how to recognize them, and they feel confident that they will not fall victim to that. So then if you look at the risk perception, so what's the risk mean to them, then you see that the majority, almost 2/3 of the respondents, indicate that they have low or even no risk of falling victim to cybercrime. So 68% thinks of that. Which is interesting is that there seems to be an optimistic bias in that, because afterwards we asked respondents, how do you view the risk of an average person in the Netherlands to become victim of cybercrime in the next year? And 47% said, yeah, we think that's a high risk. So there seems to be a optimistic bias, which means that people perceive their own risk or falling victim way lower than that of the other, in this case, an average person. Also, gender was having an effect here. We saw that women perceive the risk as higher, greater, and more severe, and especially the consequences they perceive more negative, the consequences of falling victim to a form of cybercrime. Then we looked at the self-protective behavior of respondents. So it's their perception of their self-protective behavior. We see on average the self-effectivity is scored on a scale of 1 to 5. But respondents state that they are at least above average, 3.5 out of 5, confident of their personal effectiveness of using those cybersecurity tools to protect their own business. When you look at their perception of the effectivity of the measures itself, the cybersecurity measures itself, the response effectivity, as we call it, is even higher. So 4.43 on a scale of 1 to 5. People believe in the effectiveness of cybersecurity measures. What we see in this is that also that the respondents indicate 70%, so a high amount of them indicate that they still have more need for information on this. And as the quote from the interview shows, they mainly are looking for information that's what they say normal. What they mean with normal is specific on a normal business, on a business like them. And they want the information to be as specific as possible. So what's going to come in the future? What are specific risks that are coming in the future, and what specific activities or self-protective behaviors should they perform to mitigate those risks. So that's the need of information that the respondents express. Furthermore, we asked about the actual execution of self-protective behavior. And we did this in the questionnaire by asking the respondents, showing them a list of 24 self-protective measures on protection from cybercrime, and asked them, what do you do at this moment? We saw that on average, 18 out of 24 self-protective measures were taken. And most taken measures were mostly aimed at how to handle emails, detect phishing, remove them, be aware of attachments, but also use of strong passwords, pay attention how you use your credentials, and how you treat hyperlinks. In addition, the majority, 71%, indicated that they were planning to take additional measures. So they wanted to expand their self-protective behavior. This is interesting because we found correlation with age. So the older the respondent was, the more willing he was to, or the more they were planning to undertake more additional measures. And also, which is more interesting for the research, we saw that the higher the risk perception of the respondents, the higher they were willing to undertake additional measures. So the perception of risk, of the possibility and the impact, seems to influence the measures that people want to undertake. And this is also the case with the response effectivity. So the higher the belief that people have in the effectivity of the specific cybersecurity measures, the higher their willingness to undertake more of these measures. Also, what we saw is that after asking the respondents about which measures do they undertake, we see that most of the perception of the effectivity of this behavior, or of the effectivity of what they have done to protect themselves, is relatively high. And we see that the more self-protective measures people take, the more confidence they have in that they have protected themselves in a good enough way. Well, if you look back at the model we made, we, after analysis, came down to the following model. I'm just going to put this here so you can see it well. Obviously, what we want to do is we want to see which factors increase self-protective behavior. That's what we want to engage. What we see is that the strongest correlation in increasing the self-protective behavior is in the behavioral beliefs. So that's the belief that the measures are effective, and that's the belief that I myself I'm effective in this measure. So now I'm capable of doing it, and that's by far the strongest relation that we found, but not the only one, because the next one that we found was the subjective norms. So the social environment, so the societal opinion in your social environment about these norms and the effect of these norms increase the self-protective behavior, but also the responsibility that business owners feel towards their social environment, which are their employees, also has a relation to the self-protective behavior. Furthermore, we saw that the risk perception has an influence on self-protective behavior. It's a bit smaller, but it's still a relation. So most of all, the perception of the chance that it might happen to your business, that has a relation on the self-protective behavior. So the higher perception of the chance, the higher the chance that more self-protective behavior will be undertaken. And the same amount, but in a smaller way, for the consequences. So the higher or the more severe the perception of the consequences of falling a victim, the higher the amount of self-protective behavior undertaken. So the perception of the risk by the chance and the consequences is influential on the self-protective behavior. What we further saw was that gender had an influence on this. So males seem to overestimate themselves, and females seem to see more severe risks in general. Also, the risk sensitivity and the prior victimization seem to have influence on these risk perception and therefore the self-protective behavior. So after we've seen that, we can go back to the goal of the study, and that was, can we make cybersecurity risk communication evidence-based and therefore more effective to this group of business owners in small, medium enterprises on which it aimed at. And the cool thing is, yeah, we can make it more effective, because we have seen that there are specifically three factors that influence the self-protective behavior which we want to influence. And the strongest influence is the expectation of the effectivity. So if you want to increase the self-protective behavior of these business owners, you have to influence their opinion on the effectivity of the measures itself. So they need information about that it's going to work, and you need to increase their perception of the effectivity that they themselves can have with this measure. So to make it very flat and blatant, they should know what they can do, and they should believe that it helps, but they also should be convinced that they are self-capable in doing this and have a high level of trust in that. Furthermore, we saw that their perception of the risk, which is the chance that victimization occurs, but also the consequences of these victimization, that the higher the perception of this, the more self-protective measures have been taken. And we also saw that there was optimistic bias. I'm sorry for the spelling error here, which we need to break. We see that people underestimate their own risk and overestimate maybe the risk of others. So in order to get people to take self-protective behavior, we need to break this optimistic bias and give people the information that the risk that they see for the other also applies to them. The third is to, as we saw, that the subjective norms, so the social pressure, social environment, their responsibility, social responsibility also as an entrepreneur or as a business owner, influence the self-protective behavior. So it would also be effective in future risk communication to aim your risk communication at these three terms. I'm really happy to say that the safety region of Rotterdam just launched their first risk communication campaign, which is based on these insights. So it's the cool thing that this applied research is not only delivered a model which seems to work for this subject, but it's also automatically translated in actual risk communication to increase the cybersecurity of these businesses. So we're very enthusiastic about this project. Closing down, I hope you are also enthusiastic about this project because we love doing this. Well, these are the references that have been used in this presentation, so you can look that up if you want to. I want to conclude this presentation by asking you all for your time and inviting you to come in contact with me via the email address stated here, or look one of us up on LinkedIn, and we would love to get in contact with you all to speak more about this research and further research. For now, thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of the Cybersecurity Revolution conference. Thank you.